let me start by saying that Sony's whole associated with Marvel thing that they've got going on would be so easy to make fun of, with miss after miss proving that the promise for a big box office return still isn't enough to increase their studio heads' creativity or intelligence. But they made Spider-Verse. And Avi Arad, one of those studio heads that I very much dislike, was reported to have convinced Lord and Miller to put Spot into the Spider-Verse sequel, so it's not all decision-making duds on their end. And yet, when supposedly saddled with their universe, Tom Holland, in desperation, called Kevin Feige and the CEO of Disney at the time because he didn't want to be stuck there in Sony's adjacent universe, which I don't even think was actually happening, just another boring rights dispute so someone could get paid more. But Holland was that miserable at the thought of being solely Sony's Spider-Man, and that kinda says everything. With all that being said, what I was going to ask was, where is this all going? Which I would have answered with a train wreck of a Sinister Six movie. But the second I finished the majority of editing the audio for this video, it was announced by The Wrap that Kraven was Sony's last Marvel-adjacent movie. The exact phrase used was "done for now," but that means it's all but dead, which changed the whole trajectory of this video essay, forcing me to rewrite and re-record this whole thing. And it's even more unexpected because this decision flies in the face of Kraven, tripping that movie's legs right at the starting line and dashing any chances of that being successful. Well, it was never going to be, but Sony sure seems to be closing the coffin on it. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and I would have been seated for Sony's terrible Sinister Six movie, but now all I can do is speculate on how bad it could have been. But before we even get there, let's talk about the idea of a solo villain film, which can 100% work. Sony just has yet to make a good one, and judging by their track record, probably won't. But just look at the first Joker, which I have many problems with, all of which are laid out in this video, though it's just primarily because I thought it should have been at least a smidge comic accurate. Yet that movie is undeniably emotional and made $1 billion. So it's not about whether or not a villain-focused movie can or can't work. They can. I just personally think they work 1 billion times better if the hero is in the story, even if they're in the background with barely any focus at all. Yet regardless, their presence should be felt, because how else are we supposed to care about this villainous person? I mean, The Penguin proved that was more than possible, and that show will discount pretty much every argument I have against isolated solo projects, but with good writing, anything can work. I'm more talking in generalities, especially when considering the middling Sony villain movies, because when we look at those, it's clear that the best Sony had thought of doing is giving the story an even worse person to pit the villain against, turning that villain into a hero protagonist, because God forbid these characters look bad in any shape or form. If they were, how would Sony sell their toys? And Hollywood is no stranger to presenting the audience with a truly terrible person so that compared to them, morally gray protagonists are easier to get invested in. But that is also always paired with a necessary component of each character being compelling, which doesn't have much to do with their heroic actions, but instead in how identifiable or relatable those actions are. Though that brings me to another point, that none of these villains are actual villains. And at first that was just a joke, but I genuinely think that these filmmakers and studio heads are scared of their protagonists being seen as unlikable, which comes down to the basic misunderstanding that I've been talking about, how audiences connect with characters they see on screen no matter how they align. All of these villain characters might say that they're the bad guy, but will only ever act in a manner that is to save people, because they've been shaped into heroic archetypes in generic stories that all come out as the same boring by-committee product, always featuring the same tired trope of the hero fighting a version of them, but in a darker color. Recently, Agatha, and just as I mentioned but to a more depressing extent, The Penguin, both proved that vile characters can still be compelling to watch, writing them in an interesting way that makes it so that you can't help but get behind, and aren't sanitized for the sake of them now being protagonists. Newsflash, villains are interesting. Unless the hero is written incredibly well, they usually can't compare to the layered complexity that an antagonist inherently possesses. And that's because the human problems that are subtly or not so subtly brought up in a story's themes are typically centered around the villain's motivations. I don't think every villain should have a point, but I can't deny how much I love an antagonist that is correct in what they're doing, yet just going too far with their actions. However, I do still enjoy seeing a bad guy that is just a plain old cackling bad guy. But Sony's characters aren't either. In the source material, these Spider-Man adjacent characters can be complicated and are usually in antagonistic roles, but their movie counterparts are what? Honestly, I have no clue. Are they supposed to be anti-heroes? I suppose Venom and Morbius's comic book sides have both spent time in that exact vague anti-hero role, but that also highlights a serious problem with Marvel Comics in that they refuse to make a good villain, because the moment they do, they turn them into an anti-hero. But I'm putting a pin in that for another week so that my ADHD brain can stay focused on Sony and their movies. And if those were entertaining, I wouldn't care about defining any of these characters in them. But I'm bored enough when watching one that I'm constantly thinking about how these people are meant to be perceived. All of these projects could have been great under the assumption that they were spearheaded by creative minds wanting to tell a particular story through the lens of a somewhat unknown character in Spider-Man's world. But all of that optimism washes away when you look at the truth, that these movies are only being greenlit because the studio needs to keep pumping out half-assed and cheap superhero schlock. Because if they don't, they risk letting the rights lapse back into Marvel's hands, who may not be saints in everyone's eyes right now, but is so much more trustworthy than Sony. So when we look to their supposed future, at the numerous projects announced by Sony in some way or another, it's hard not to find their confidence in the past hilarious. And when I'm listing off all of these announced movies and TV shows, I'll attempt to focus on the projects that were something. Because for every half-confirmed project, there's a dozen rumored ones. After all, I never believed an Aunt May spy thriller was ever actually going to happen. A supposed movie idea that was leaked in Sony's hack years and years ago. And of those, there's the Silk Spider Society TV show, and there was also the El Muerto movie, the only good thing of which to come out is the Weekly Planet's joke pitch for, which needs to be heard if you haven't. There was also some kind of Silver and Black movie that combined the separate Silver Sable and Black Cat films that were lined up and each fell in on themselves. A jackpot movie that has completely fallen apart, and the least confirmed of all, a rumored Night Watch movie by Spike Lee. And of course you can't forget about the Spider Noir series, which I didn't mention before because it's probably not attached to any of this anyway, but I am hesitantly excited for that. Obviously, if the Noir series or anything else is profitable enough, Sony will find a way to revive their universe and shoehorn it in. Which, to move on to that, according to every bit of research I have done, it really did seem like an oddball Sinister Six movie without a Spider-Man was in the cards. A similar heist-ish movie was going to happen in Andrew Garfield's universe, and by Drew Goddard no less, but presumably Spider-Man was going to be a main player in that story. So without just stating the obvious, that Spider-Man should be in any Sinister Six movie, instead, I want to quickly mention the other Sinister Six that the MCU was setting up. Every time I thought of Holland's Spider-Man, an accompanying thought was always his rogues being built up. I'm talking Shocker, Scorpion, Chameleon, Vulture, hell, throw in Tinkerer. He can't do much physically, but he can give everyone cool tech and suits. I'm incredibly surprised we haven't seen much of them as of yet, considering all of them were set up to return in some way or another. And then there's Mysterio, who could still come back even if Quentin Beck is dead. And hey, look at that. I may not like that team necessarily, but there's 6 out of 6 already floating around in the MCU. And if I'm being entirely honest, that's the only version of the Sinister Six that I'm even slightly interested in. I have no clue how Sony's Venom, Morbius, and Madam Web characters were supposed to come together in a compelling way. And that's without even bringing up the rumor that these people will form a team to defeat the cosmic threat that is Null. Maybe if he did anything in Venom 3, I'd be more inclined to let this slide. Perhaps I would have even let myself get a little excited. But when it comes to what we've seen of Sony's Null, not necessarily the ancient cosmic entity held back by the Celestials that's featured in the comics, I can't say I'm thrilled to see him again. And while I am convinced that this was probably happening, thanks to multiple rumor outlets reporting on it as if it were fact, but I will never be convinced that this was ever going to be good. But to wrap up, I'll ask you, are you sad that Sony's Marvel-adjacent movies are gone? I mean, we still have Spider-Verse, but are you disappointed we'll never get to see Morbius 2 back in the habit? Drop a comment and let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.